Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bandoma Callado. I am a senior associate attorney at the Dolan law firm and one of the co-chairs of AABA's Civil Rights Committee. We are pleased to put on this webinar, Rising Against Hate. Our speakers will discuss how San Francisco Bay Area leaders, organizations, and law enforcement are addressing the rise in bias against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders since the COVID-19 outbreak. I will be moderating this webinar. While the scapegoating of AAPIs and other minority groups during a public health or economic crisis is nothing new, it is important to recognize the surge in the incidence of discrimination and hate crimes in society during this pandemic. We will be discussing how we, as members of the legal community, can work together to rise against hate. As of last week, the Stop AAPI Hate Reporting Center has received almost 1,500 reports of verbal harassment, shunning, and physical assaults against AAPIs since its launch on March 19. Cynthia Choi, co-executive director of Chinese for Affirmative Action, one of the organizations that founded the Stop AAPI Hate Reporting Center, will be speaking about the findings and emerging trends from the collected data. We also have San Francisco District Attorney Chesa Boudin speaking about his office's response to hate crimes against AAPIs. He will also address the withdrawal of charges against one of the two suspects in the Bayview attack of an Asian man and the plan to pursue a restorative justice model approach. Our third speaker, Aarti Kohli, the Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Asian Law Caucus, will be speaking about leading a coordinated response on this issue, as well as Trump's administration's April 22nd executive order. Finally, AABA President and San Francisco Police Commissioner John Hamasaki will be speaking on working with our allies, community groups, and law enforcement to ensure the safety and security of the AAPI community. Before we get started, I want to remind all of you that this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of California Elimination of Bias MCLE credit. Please sign in for this event by clicking the link in the live chat or by refreshing and clicking the link at the beginning of the video description. In the description, you will also find links to written materials, evaluation form, and the event registration form. AABA will send certificates of attendance to all registered attendees. If you have not registered yet, please register on AABA's website at the link in the video description. Our speakers' bios are in the written materials provided to you. We will be setting aside a few minutes at the end of this webinar for questions. Please type in your questions in the chat box and the speakers will address them during the Q&A portion of this webinar. Our first speaker is Cynthia Choi, co-executive director of CAA. Cynthia has led local, state, and national community-based organizations working on a range of issues from reproductive justice, gender-based violence, immigrant refugee rights, and environmental justice issues in both nonprofit sector and in philanthropy. Hi, Cynthia. Thanks again for speaking with us this afternoon. Cynthia, I think you're on mute.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mari, and really thank AABA for hosting this very important conversation about the rise in anti-Asian hate. Of course, this is not a new issue. This has been a long-standing issue since the early migration of immigrants to this country. And of course, we've seen waves of anti-Asian racism and xenophobia throughout our history. But of course, this is a unique situation that I hope that we can address in tonight's panel that's related to this pandemic, both the public health crisis that we're in, and of course, the economic havoc that it's caused as well. So just a little bit about CAA. We are a community-based organization founded in San Francisco, and we address local issues as well as statewide, and we get involved in issues that have national significance. And of course, we have worked on issues from immigrant rights to education equity, economic justice, and advancing racial justice. And so this has been a core area of our work since our founding. And so as soon as they were reporting about the coronavirus in China, we were monitoring this very closely because we know full well that the US and China relations and any foreign policy issues has a direct impact on the lives of Chinese and Asian Americans. So the coverage of the issue and statements by our current administration, we knew that the situation would get worse, and we wanted to understand the magnitude of this anti-Asian backlash that we were seeing in news accounts. And so CAA, along with San Francisco State Asian American Studies Department and APCON, which is a coalition based in Los Angeles, the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, formed Stop AAPI Hate. And it's a reporting center that community members can report firsthand accounts of hate that they've experienced. And it's currently available in 11 languages, including English. So if it's okay, I'd like to show our video to provide a little bit more context.
You keep calling this the Chinese virus. There are reports of dozens of incidents of bias against Chinese Americans in this country. Secretary Azar says he does not use this term. He says ethnicity does not cause the virus.
It's not racist at all. No, not at all. It comes from China. That's why.
I think there's a great deal of misplaced fear directed at the Asian community.
In this situation, sometimes it's easy to move into perspectives in which there tends to be discrimination, there tends to be violation of human rights, there tends to be stigma on innocent people.
The moment really shifted the way I think about the larger Asian American community and this idea that we just have to stand up for each other.
Great, thank you. Before I show some of our findings, I did want to share some of the context in which the reason why we started this reporting center. So again, I think I talked about the racialization of this deadly infectious disease, the way that it was being weaponized, and the fact that there was deteriorating US-China relations, again, was leading to policies that were anti-Asian. And of course, the rhetoric around that was anti-China had also led to, I think, the unequal treatment of Asians here, and in particular, Chinese Americans. So one of the things that I do want to say, and we can pull up the first slide, is that we believe that this is not necessarily representative, the data that we're receiving in the reports, but that really it's a sampling. And actually to date, we've received over 1,700 reports, incident reports of hate. And we're very careful that we don't call them hate crimes. And I can talk a little bit more about why we're making those distinctions. And you can see that we're getting incident reports from all over the country. But a majority of them are coming from first California, and the other leading state is New York. And in the Bay Area, 18% of those incidents, or 18% of the California incidents are from the Bay Area. And you could see that we have particular populations, vulnerable populations that we've identified. So seniors are involved in 10% of the incidents. We also have about 30% of the incidents young adults. And then women are 2 times more likely to experience harassment than men. And of course, could be lots of reasons for that as well, which is that women in general face much more street harassment. And keeping in mind, again, that really this is all happening while we're sheltering in place. And that right now, many of these incidents are only taking place in places that people are frequenting, grocery stores, pharmacies, and big big box retail. Let's go to our next slide. So as you can see here, all APIs are being affected. However, a majority are Chinese or self-described as Chinese. And what we do know from the descriptions of the incident reports is that the intended target is Chinese, simply because of what they described as what was said to them. So, you know, F China, go back to China, you brought this virus here, invoking Trump, invoking Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus. These are all things that we can attribute to being really about being anti-Chinese, and again, who the intended target is, although you can see all APIs again are affected. And then I really want to spend a little bit of time talking about the types of discrimination. So a majority of what we would consider verbal harassment, and I don't want to minimize this, many of the descriptions of this verbal harassment are harrowing, are hateful, are misogynistic and racist in terms of epithets that are used. And many of our respondents have talked about being shocked, being emotionally scarred by these issues. And I think, again, I wouldn't even call them, many have called, you know, these incidents like microaggressions. I think that they are very much harrowing experiences, as I mentioned. There's another category that we would constitute as physical assaults. They could be considered hate crimes as well. And we have looked at, you know, whether they reported to police or what were the situations. A lot of times these incidents are very fleeting, and they don't even, there's no action that can be taken. So those could be some of the reasons why law enforcement wasn't involved. And then there's another category of civil rights violations. So experiences that people are having in the workplace, refusal or denial of service. This makes up the third category. And as you can see, in terms of sites of discrimination, it's happening at private businesses and in parks and neighborhoods. These are places where people are limited to go. And one of the things that we want to really make clear today is that it's important to recognize that we have to prepare for a potential surge in the rise in anti-Asian hate and violence. Just in the same way that crime is down, we are seeing some of these hate incidents being limited in their nature. And I think that part of the reasons why we have this reporting center is so that we can understand the nature and the extent of it and what are measures that we can put into place. So I do want to spend time talking about the fact that, again, this isn't anything new, but it has been exacerbated by the pandemic. And part of this issue that we have to address is that there's a current attempt right now to really shift blame to China. And as you can see with the run up to the elections, that rhetoric will be ratcheted up. And there's very little understanding or nuance in terms of the difference between Chinese government and Chinese people and Chinese Americans here and Asian Americans by extension. And so we also know that polls that have been done by Americans who, across political affiliations, blame China and feel as though China should be held accountable. And what we know that will translate into is attacks against Asians, and we will pay the ultimate price around that. So what can we actually do? What we really want to do with this data, and we've already done, is we're sharing this anonymized data with government agencies that are dedicated to addressing racism and xenophobia. So Human Rights Commission's Office of Racial Equities, and this is across the country, we've made this data available. An example of this right now in California is that we're working with the governor's office to ask that he form a task force, just in the same way that he's formed an economic recovery and public health task force. We believe that there should be one that's focused on anti-Asian racism, and employing all the agencies such as the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, the superintendents, public health, and in particular, agencies that are dedicated to offering mental health services. These are agencies that we feel will be really instrumental, and that they work with community-based organizations who have the trust and the understanding of the community's needs. And then two other areas is that we are very committed to also identifying resources and gaps in terms of services and gaps for resources for community members that are impacted. So one of the issues is language access and making sure that mental health resources, as well as ways to protect themselves and their families against this type of hate, is going to be essential. And then finally, we are using this as a moment to work across and within our communities to identify ways in which we can address the underlying causes of racism, just in the same way that this pandemic has exposed tremendous structural inequality. We need to get to the heart of why this is happening. And most importantly, we want to ensure that we don't contribute towards criminalization, and that we work in solidarity with other affected communities. So I'll end my presentation there, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for sharing the data and findings with us. Our next speaker is Chesa Boudin, the new district attorney of San Francisco. In his first 2 months in office, Chesa implemented California's first diversion program for primary caregivers, ended the office's practice of asking for cash bail, eliminated status enhancements, and ended the prosecution of charges resulting from racist pretextual traffic stops.
Well, thank you so much for the warm introduction. It's an honor to be here with all of you. I'm so appreciative of AABA for bringing us together. And of course, to all of the other speakers for the incredible work that they are doing in the community, in partnership with my agency and with so many other areas of government to help make San Francisco a city that lives up to its values and potential for all of its residents. I've lived in the Sunset for many years, and just yesterday I was reading the most recent edition of the Sunset Beacon. And one of the front page articles was describing a series of hate crimes in the Sunset neighborhood. Each of those cases involved real people, real victims who had been targeted because of their perceived race or ethnicity or language, and who had been harmed by the way in which they were treated by someone, again, because of their race or language or perceived ethnicity. People who now feel a sense of fear or trepidation before they leave their homes and go out into their neighborhood to do errands. It is totally unacceptable in a city like San Francisco with our values and our resources and our commitment to equality that people would live in fear in their own homes simply because of a protected part of their identity. Now, when we talk about hate crimes or hate activity, we're talking about a lot of different things. Sometimes we're talking about specific threats. Sometimes we're talking about acts of violence or property destruction. And other times we're simply talking about racist behavior or words, which may not amount to a crime. So I want to talk briefly about what we do in the DA's office, about the distinction between hateful or discriminatory activity and a hate crime. I'll share a few statistics And then I will also talk about a particular high-profile case here in San Francisco. So first, what do we do in the district attorney's office? We help implement criminal justice policy with an eye towards preventing crime and ensuring that people who are engaged in the criminal justice system, who've been accused of a crime, have an opportunity to be rehabilitated or restored in a way that prevents crime in the future once they are released back to the community. Another critical function of our office is to provide support to crime victims, victim services. And finally, one of our core functions is to make decisions about who to file criminal charges against and then to prosecute cases where there are criminal charges that have been filed, to decide what punishment is appropriate, to present evidence to the court or to juries in those cases that go to trial. Now, we're often presented with incidents that have been reported to the police as a hate crime. One of our initial challenges is to evaluate the strength of the evidence and to find the balance between protected First Amendment activity on the one hand and criminal activity on the other. One of the things that makes this country so great and that helps contribute to its strength and its diversity is our commitment to free speech. And that means that racist speech and some racist behavior is actually protected by the Constitution. Even very offensive language that has no place in our system of values may be protected by the US Constitution. So only very specific combinations of acts or words that can be criminally prosecuted. And in order to criminally prosecute a regular crime, say vandalism or robbery, as a hate crime, we have to have enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the crime was committed because of or motivated by, or the victim was targeted because of their race, religion, ethnic identity, or some other protected aspect of their identity, sexual orientation, for example. Now, it should come as no surprise that hate crimes in the United States in general and in California and San Francisco in particular have been on the rise over the last several years. We have a tremendous amount of xenophobia and racism that is being spewed out of Washington, D.C. by the federal government. And that racism, that xenophobia, whether it be targeted at immigrants from Latin America during the last presidential campaign, for example, or whether it be targeted at Asian immigrants in the context of, or Asian members of the community in the context of the coronavirus and COVID-19, contributes to and often explicitly encourages racism, xenophobia, and acts of violence against members of the immigrant community or against people of color. Hate crimes in the United States have continually increased since 2015. We have seen in California that same trend. In San Francisco, hate crimes were at an all-time low in 2014, with just 24 incidents reported to law enforcement. However, as in the rest of the country, we have seen an increase since 2015 during the Trump administration. San Francisco saw a 49% increase in reported potential hate crime incidents from 2017 to 2018 alone. And remember, that was before the coronavirus. The San Francisco District Attorney's Office, the office which I have the privilege and honor of leading since January of this year, has prosecuted 69% of all hate crime cases that were presented to us by the police department from 2011 through March of 2020. Now, that is a higher percentage of cases filed than we see on average for other cases presented to us. We take hate crimes very seriously. We work closely with the San Francisco Police Department and other law enforcement agencies to take action in those cases wherever the law and the evidence and the interests of justice allow. I want to talk about more recent statistics. In 2019, specifically, we were presented with 24 hate crime incidents, and we filed criminal charges in the majority of those cases as hate crimes. Some of those cases we filed criminal charges in, but did not have enough evidence to attach a hate crime allegation or a specific charge to. But fully half were filed as hate crimes. Now, in 2020, so far this year, we have already seen 17 hate crime incidents presented to our office. That is a very high number. Remember, this is an increase over last year and over historic averages. And we have taken action in many of those cases as well. I want to talk again briefly about some national statistics. In 2018, we saw 4,571 hate crimes cases, which was a 16-year high. Now, I'm talking now specifically about interpersonal attacks. That statistic does not include other potential hate crimes, such as vandalism. This is obviously a very serious problem. It's a threat to the unity and strength of our community. It's a threat to specific groups within our community who are vulnerable or marginalized by these attacks. It is absolutely unacceptable that this behavior is promoted and encouraged by many elected officials at the national level. And here in San Francisco, I am proud to say that our elected officials, that our community leaders like those on this video training with me today are standing in unison, in unity, with arms linked against this kind of behavior. We are determined to be proactive in our rejection of hate and crimes and discrimination based on hate. Now, we do not, in the San Francisco District Attorney's Office, have the mandate or the ability to take action against some discrimination, which might be actionable in a civil case. Civil rights lawyers, for example, could file lawsuits seeking money damages or seeking a change in policy by a business that discriminates. Our work primarily focuses on those hateful activities that amount to a crime. So what do? We work, as I said, in partnership with the San Francisco Police Department primarily. Late last month, we released a video in multiple languages describing hate crimes, raising awareness about hate crimes, and informing people who are victims or witnesses to hate crimes of what to do in the context of that sort of activity. And of course, the primary thing to do if and when you are a victim or a witness to a hate crime in progress is to call 911. We also are working specifically around expanding the tools we use to respond. We know that hateful behavior is motivated by ignorance, and often prison time or jail time alone will not change those ignorant thoughts and beliefs. We had a recent high-profile case, which I'll mention very briefly in the little time I have left, and I'm happy to discuss it in more detail during Q&A, where a Chinese senior who was gathering recycling in the Bayview was targeted in a video that went viral. His recycling that he'd worked hard to collect, that he used to pay his rent, was robbed from him. And it was done on video. And the person making the video appeared to say hateful, racist things during this robbery. Now, 2 individuals were arrested by the police and brought to our office. One of them was the person who made the video. Very important to remember that making a video, documenting someone else's criminal activity, and even saying racist or hateful things in that video is not a crime. It's unacceptable, it's intolerable, and we are determined to change people's behavior when they engage in that kind of conduct. But we took that case and we did not file criminal charges. Instead, we diverted that individual into a restorative justice community-based process aimed at rebuilding the relationships between him and between the individual victim in this case and the broader Chinese community that was so offended, appropriately so, as we all were, by this conduct. The other individual who actually committed the robbery was charged with a robbery, was held in jail for a period of time, and is still facing very serious charges. we try to take a case-by-case approach, and we try to empower victims of these crimes to have a voice in what approach we take. In this instance, we respected the wishes of the victim, who did not want to see crimes charged against the individual who made the video. He was gracious, he was generous, and he had the wisdom of his age in saying that the person who made the video was young and foolish. And we were working on a process that can respect the victim's wishes and hopefully change the hearts and minds of people who engage in this kind of racist behavior. But we stand with our communities, and we will file charges in cases that demand and justify criminal charges being filed. I'm happy to take questions afterwards. And again, I want to thank AABA for organizing, and all of you for joining us today.
Thank you again so much, Chesa, for speaking with us this afternoon and sharing your office's response to hate crimes. Our next speaker this afternoon is Aarti Kohli. She is currently the executive director at ALC, the first organization in the country to represent and promote the legal and civil rights of Asian and Pacific Islander communities. She also helps guide the state and national policy work of the Advancing Justice Affiliation with partners in LA, Chicago, Atlanta, and Washington, DC. Thank you so much, Aarti, for speaking with AABA today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really honored to be on this great panel. So I would like to share my PowerPoint. You all can see it. If you could go to the next slide, please.
Aarti, I think you have to press from beginning.
Oh.
Thanks.
Okay. Beginning. Okay. Did that work?
It did. I think you control the slides.
Oh, all right. Sorry, I'm just still learning the technology. So what I wanted to share was some of the work that we do that is informing how we're responding to anti-Asian hate. And I will share a personal anecdote, which is that actually our office manager went to pick up some things from the office, even though it's closed, this Monday, and discovered that our office sign had been tagged by a white supremacy group. And it was a sticker that, said, "Reclaim America." And the same group apparently has been tagging businesses in Seattle, Chinatown. So this really hits home for us. And we, in addition to seeing the stark data, that Cynthia shared, we also have a Stand Against Hatred hate tracker, which actually we started in 2016 because we had been hearing so many anecdotes about, even back then, anti-China sentiments leading to people being spat upon and being told to go back to your country. And it became really clear that this was going to be a ongoing issue for our communities. So one of the areas of work that we do is criminal justice reform. And we're fighting against mass incarceration. And one of the reasons is that we've been working with Southeast Asian communities for a long time. These are communities who came as refugees from Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam. The children came often very young, were born in Thai refugee camps, and they came from violence and war and were relocated without support into neighborhoods that had a lot of violence and trauma. So many of the young men in particular joined gangs. As a result of the gang activity, committed crimes and went to prison. And the vast, majority of them turn their lives around. And so they came out and often, went in as youth and came out as adults and served incredibly long sentences. And when they came out, were then placed in deportation. And the Trump administration in particular, when they came into office, has been pushing the deportation of these communities. And so our work with these communities and working hand in hand with directly impacted people made us think really deeply about how we want to approach criminalization and mass incarceration. And is that always the answer to the trauma that our communities face? So that's one piece of work that informs what we do. The other piece of work was that we've since 9/11, we've been working with Muslim, Arab, South Asian communities, both to look at what, how people were being impacted post 9/11. We saw lots of hate offenses against people who are perceived to be Muslim, particularly Sikh Americans. There was a mass shooting in Oak Creek in Wisconsin, and we also saw the state responding by surveillance and FBI visits that had no due process or reasonable suspicion. And so once again, we were working hand in hand and with communities and had staff members from communities who were directly impacted by law enforcement practices, which resulted in a lack of trust in law enforcement. And I think what's hard too is there's a lot of evidence that in immigration and in ICE and even perhaps even in the FBI, that there are members of those government agencies that are actually white supremacists themselves. So that makes it hard for us to turn to those agencies as the answer. And that really helped me when I was thinking about, well, how do I respond to this white supremacy sign? And one of the things that we decided is not to lift up the organization that put the sign on our office, because we don't want to actually also promote white supremacists. This is kind of what they're looking for. And we decided actually not to report it to the FBI because we didn't feel like that was the place that we wanted to go. But what we did do, and what I have been thinking, we decided to do a while ago, is to bring together API leaders from across the country, and including CAA, and Cynthia was gracious enough to be in that meeting. And part of the reason we brought API leaders together is we feel like we need a coordinated national response, and we need a national table where we grapple with how do we, in a coordinated fashion, respond to this. And some of the ways that we're thinking of breaking down this work is narrative, because I think Cynthia's mentioned this too, the rhetoric is so key. We see from the Trump administration that calling it the China virus, I have no doubt has led to an increase in the hate crimes or hate incidents. And the anti-China rhetoric is going to continue, and it's not just going to come from the Trump administration. It's going to come from many folks. And I think that as APIs, we really have to build our own narrative and make sure that it gets out there. And we need accountability from local and state officials as well. The other piece of work that we see that's really important to do is policy work. We have seen post 9/11 how the anti-interpersonal violence turns into state violence. And in this meeting that we had where we were doing scenario planning for what could happen, we were imagining some immigration policy. And as it turned out, a few days after our meeting, Trump's immigration ban was released. And although it's not explicit in talking about Asian Americans, what it's saying is spouses and children of green card holders aren't able to come for 60 days. Nearly all parents and adult children of U.S. citizens and applicants for most employment-based immigrant visas. The reality is that this will disproportionately impact Asian Americans. We have the most backlogs in our communities. You have backlogs from China, the Philippines, India, and if this ban is extended, which is entirely possible, so it was for 60 days starting April 20th, but we have seen with other bans, most notably the Muslim ban, that when they initially talked about it, it was supposed to be a temporary ban. And so we know that this can, this could be extended, and if it is, it could impact as much as 660,000 people, many of whom are from our communities. So we really have to look at policy broadly when we think about, what does the anti-China hate bring? In the last working group we are contemplating bringing together is solidarity, because we really need to think about how we build cross-racial understanding. We do know from the incidents that are being reported, that I'm sorry, I am lost. Oh, here I am. Okay. All right. The incidents that are being reported, that there are, unfortunately, there is hate coming at us from other communities of color. And I think, this is something we also even have to talk about as API communities, because there is some elements of anti-Blackness even in our communities, and sometimes even anti-immigrant sentiment. And we have to actually grapple with it, because if we don't grapple with it and pretend it's all okay, we're not going to be able to get to a better place. And so these are some of the issues that we are looking at in terms of how do we do this as API organizations across the country? How do we do this as a community? So I am gonna hand it back to Mari. I think I had some additional points in terms of what you can do, but I think that'll come up in the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aarti. I'm sure our AABA members and folks in the community who are watching will want to know how we can support organizations like ALC as well as CAA. Our next speaker is John Hamasaki. John is AABA's current president, and he serves as a San Francisco Police Commissioner. John is a trial lawyer and the founder of Hamasaki Law, where he defends individuals facing prosecution in state and federal courts throughout Northern California. John has built the practice with a focus on defending constitutional protections in complex criminal cases implicating civil rights and civil liberties. Hi, John. Thanks so much for speaking with us this afternoon.
Thank you, and I really want to start off by saying thank you again to all of the other speakers. Aarti and Cynthia are really the ground level leaders in our Asian American community, or some of the ground level leaders in our Asian American community that are out there every single day working to make change and bring about positive change within our community and within our community's relationship with other communities, with local government, state government. And I've worked with both of them throughout the years to help with those missions, and then also with some of the work that I've been doing. And I want to give a big thanks to District Attorney Chesa Boudin, who he kicked off his time in the DA's office by really reaching out to the Asian American community, because in San Francisco we have such a large Asian American community, but we've also had some real challenges over the last few years, and Cynthia and I have worked pretty closely on a case that's qualifies would definitely qualify as a hate crime, and it's having these relationships with our local officials that have helped us to bring about some degree of peace and security to our communities. I wanted to start with a personal anecdote that I shared with our AABA's members this week, which is, like a lot of Asian Americans in this country of a certain age, we grew up with this. I spent my elementary school years running home from school, being chased by bullies with all of the same things that we've already heard. Go back to China. I'm not Chinese. I'm actually half Japanese, half Caucasian, but that doesn't really get through to 7-8-year-olds. But I told my wife a few weeks ago that growing up in San Francisco in the Bay Area, I was worried that our son Omar was going to get soft because he doesn't have to go through the fights that I went through growing up. And it's really, it's hard right now. It's hard for all of us to see what's going on in our communities. And I participated in another webinar last week with NAPABA, which is the National Asian American Bar Association, and the issue of hate crimes and bias-related incidents came up, and it's really happening all across the country. And as Chesa identified, not everything rises to the level of criminal conduct, but that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt, and that doesn't mean it doesn't tear apart communities, and that doesn't mean that I'm perfectly open about it. Being subjected to that as a child really defined me. It just, knowing that I was not part of the community, or I didn't feel like I was part of the community, or I was having to run and having to learn how to fight at a young age, that caused a lot of childhood challenges. And luckily, I think they turned around and brought me to the work that I do now, and brought me towards AABA and brought me towards the police commission, because, I learned at a young age, and I probably had a more intelligent understanding of it as I grew older, that, we all need to be involved. Asian Americans need to be involved. And I know that coming over, a lot of first generation families, are concerned and really want to just, get their heads down and work hard and succeed. But, the community needs to get involved when there's issues like this, because it's great when we can work with our local law enforcement to the degree that it's necessary, but we really also need to be working with our community, other Asian American communities, and all of our allies within the community, and other minority groups who have gone through similar struggles. Okay, Asian Americans have a long history of standing up for other allies in our other communities, and I think it's time that probably we should be reaching out and saying, hey, this is pretty tough right now. We could use your help. Get behind us, because people are getting hurt. And I've heard other stories about children now being teased about being, the source of the Chinese virus, right? And that's something that in 2020 we shouldn't have in this country. But we have an administration at the top of the government that is leading this charge in discrimination and hatred. I'll go so far as to say hatred, and it trickles down into people, and I don't think it's a stretch to say that we're this government and the way this government is using this crisis, and it's a real crisis in this country. We're all suffering and struggling right now, to reflame anti-Asian bias that, to those of us who have studied our history, who know our history, who have listened to the stories from our parents, our grandparents, our aunties, our uncles. This isn't new, okay? This has come before, and there's waves of it throughout our history in this country. And you know, I'm grateful for all of the work that all of the speakers here tonight are doing. And what I wanted to say, and I don't need to take up much of your time, but what I wanted to say is that there's a few things that I think that we need to do in this country as Asian Americans, but also as people who care about you know, discrimination, hatred, bias generally, which is, I think, you know, most good people. I think there's a lot of good people out there. You know, the negativity and the bad incidents are highlighted, but I do want to think that most people are good people. But the problem is sometimes that those people, you know, don't get involved. And for us as Asian Americans, I think it's incumbent upon us to get more involved in other communities alongside of our own. And so, you know, when I was saying the first generation, well, now those of us in the third and fourth and fifth generation, really having relationships with other communities and not just our own. And then I also wanted to tie around to how I became involved in the police commission, which is the need to really support our community. And for my role in the police commission, right now I'm the only Asian American police commissioner. It's a civilian oversight agency that works with the police departments and the Department of Police Accountability to ensure that our department is properly functioning, is undergoing reforms, and is a department that we can be proud of in also defending our communities from all types of bias, anti-Asian bias, and also not being involved in it themselves, which unfortunately we've had a history of in this city. But, you know, being a police commissioner has given me the opportunity to go out to communities that have been directly impacted by bias and help them and work with them and connect with them with people like Aarti and Cynthia, and connect them with Chesa if there's a criminal case, or talk to our chief of police, Bill Scott, who's been a great leader around this issue. And but, you know, it's that type of involvement that I think we all really need to it's incumbent upon us to be make the outreach and get involved in government, in politics, with your state and local officials. I know it's not, you know, I never thought I was going to be AABA president or a police commissioner, but when the opportunities came up and I saw the impact that I could have in helping to address and heal some of these wounds, you know, I thought it was my responsibility. And so I'd like everybody in the community to also be willing to take up the banner to fight against hate, fight against discrimination, fight against harassment, and come together, because, you know, the Asian American community is the community that you know, where I come from, but that I love. But you know, we're under attack right now, and this is the time we need to rise to meet the challenge. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Mari, and I think we can go to some questions and answers.
Thank you so much, John, for your leadership. And thank you again to Cynthia, Chesa, and Aarti as well for speaking on this important issue. So we will now be opening up the webinar to questions from the audience for our speakers.
I believe that this question is about the data that was presented through Stop API Hate. If that's the case, these are all self-reported, so first-hand accounts that they themselves or a family member encountered. And in some instances, they were also reports of incidents that people witnessed firsthand. So that's what our data reflects. And my understanding is that a portion of those who reported did also report to the police, but that is not where we get our data from.
And just to add on to that, thank you for that, Cynthia. The statistics I referenced in my presentation about the number of cases presented to us by the police and the number that we filed charges in, those are limited to a much narrower group of only those cases that resulted in a police report and then had the police present the case to my office. So it's a smaller subset of the total that Cynthia referenced.
I could address that, but Aarti, I think you all are doing some great bystander trainings too.
Yeah. Well, if you want to do the victim,
Sure.
Piece, and then I can talk about the bystander.
Okay.
Okay.
Aarti and I are a team. We do these panels together. So yes, this is a really important question because as it's been reiterated throughout the panel tonight, many of these situations are shocking and they're not necessarily reportable. And people want to know what to do in those situations. And it's very scary and threatening. So one of the things that we did, and I should have thought of presenting it, but you can go to Stop API Hate, are some easy 5 steps that you can do if you're experiencing harassment. And we always center the person who's being targeted as making their own judgment around safety. And then also really keeping in mind that not everyone can speak out and defend themselves. We're talking about limited English speaking community members, women, other vulnerable populations. So our tips that you can find on the website are really focused on safety, de-escalation, and making sure that you get the emotional support, what we often found is that individuals turn to their immediate networks. They don't call law enforcement. They don't even call a social services organization. They're really contacting and reaching out to their family and friends.
Yeah, I will just add to that there is bystander training that is available, and we can help facilitate that. One of the organizations we've been working with is Hollebeck, but there are Bay Area organizations that have also done bystander training. What's really sad in some of the reports that we've gotten is that there are often, when there's verbal harassment, this is pre-COVID or pre-shelter in place, people were like in a coffee shop and had someone say something to them, and this is in Berkeley and Oakland. This is not, in the Central Valley, and there's like total silence. No one actually saying to the harasser, this is not acceptable. And no one going to stand next to the person who has been victimized and sort of showing solidarity. And that's just shameful. And I feel like, I do agree with Cynthia. Part of it is, for some people, it may be a measure of feeling safe enough to do that. For other people, I'm not sure what's going on. But I'm not going to do a bystander intervention training right now, but basically some of the basic things I could just highlight is some of the tips are to distract, find a way to, draw the attention away from the victim. If you feel like it's severe and you can get assistance from a third party who has more authority, depending on what's happening, you can call the police or whatever you need to do. Document, take notes. I mean, we've seen so much video evidence of what actually happens to people. Delay, go up and talk to the victim. And then, and this is, I think, has to be done very safely, directly confront the harasser and tell them that it's not acceptable. But I would really encourage people to take a bystander intervention training if they can. I think that would be helpful.
Aarti, can I ask, is that being offered into schools and other places where it's something that people can learn at a young age and start to become, and I understand there is, and I've reviewed a lot of the bystander training manuals and policies and so forth, which are great. But how is that being put out through the community?
Yeah, so that's a difficult question. I think when I was talking about this API table, that one of the other issues that we're thinking about is education. So when we go back from sheltering in place, a lot of schools have bullying curriculum, and this could be incorporated into that more intentionally, and should be. And I think part of what we're, this is all the work that needs to happen, which is how do you get that up to scale? One of the things that is happening, I think there's, in addition to the actual addressing the bullying, there's also just like having API children understand that their history and the history of racism in this country, and like ensuring that that's part of curriculums as well. So as part of API Heritage Month, there's a documentary on APIs that's going to be shown on PBS. In relation to that, there is going to be a curriculum for teachers in relation to that documentary. And so that will also be a resource for schools, I think, to talk about some of the history of what, whether it's Vincent Chin or other times in our history when Asian Americans have been targeted.
I see the question, and it's a great question. I appreciate that. Thank you for asking, Larry. Without getting into all of the technicalities, the simple way to explain it is if you take a regular crime, any crime, for example, let's say vandalism or an assault or a robbery, if we can prove that that crime, whatever it was committed because of the victim's actual or perceived race, color, religion, ancestry, national origin, disability, gender, or sexual orientation, then we can add a hate crime allegation to the underlying substantive criminal charge, let's say vandalism, robbery, or assault. There are many cases. Sorry, John, just one last thing and then jump in. There are many cases, as John knows well, where we see all of the trappings of motivation because of one of those, sort of factors that we just described, where we see people use a racial slur in the context of committing a crime, but where we don't have enough evidence to prove to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that the crime was motivated because of. And in those cases, it's a difficult case-by-case decision for us as to whether or not to file the hate crime allegation on top of the underlying charge. I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
Oh, no. I think I was going to follow up on, or I forget exactly what I was going to follow up on, but it has to be, for people watching who aren't in the criminal field like Chesa and I, you have to be able to prove what somebody's intent is when they're committing that crime, right? And so, unless it's a hard burden to meet. I'll say that, and I know that a few, not in the recent history, but the DA's office had some cases that seemed high profile with hate crimes allegations that they ended up losing at trial because it's a very hard burden to meet to prove what somebody's thinking when they're doing something, right? I mean, it may be more obvious when somebody's saying the exact, racial epithets while they're beating somebody up, but it has to. You don't want to create, and I apologize if I'm speaking for your office, Chesa, but I don't think that I don't think it does any good to file hate crimes allegations if they're not sustainable. I understand that people want to see that, but if it goes to a trial and a jury and it loses, I think, and I've worked with victims throughout my career. I know that can have a real impact as well. And so I think that what Chesa's office has been doing is really working with victims to understand, all of their rights and all of their potential remedies, right? And what the appropriate steps to take are in a certain case. And, I think I got some backlash about Chesa's decision regarding the restorative justice case from some of our members. And they're saying, why is our district attorney, going through restorative justice with somebody who's beating up an old man? Well, okay, first of all, it wasn't the guy that was hitting him. That's a separate matter, and that's being dealt with. This was a kid who just videoed it. And, there's some real community issues that we all need to deal with there, and that Cynthia and I have been working on certain cases. But it doesn't, it doesn't change the pain that underlies all of these, even if it doesn't rise to the level of a hate crime. And I think that, just focusing on hate crimes, it does a disservice to the overall impact that this has on our community, because it hurts no matter or not if it's a crime, no matter or not if it's a crime. So with that,
may I also add to that? One of the reasons why we looked at the data very carefully is because we wanted to make sure that people understood the nature of what was happening. And if you look at our data, a majority of these incidents, they're not crimes because they're protected speech or behavior. And so it really does point to the limits of a hate crimes framework and the legal framework, and really points to the need that we need to do to strengthen relationships between communities, to address some of the drivers of economics, of living in low-income communities where there's lack of opportunities, and how we can try to address some of the educational components that we talk about, requirements around ethnic studies and understanding each other's history, as well as giving, and as well as focusing on, again, what are measures that are going to restore and heal our communities. Because the truth of the matter is, when one community member is harmed and is a victim of violence, the entire community hurts. And this is something that we're seeing over and over again in the city of San Francisco, where there's been very high profile cases, including the one that Chesa had described. And we're part of a coalition that was trying to provide support to the elder recycler. And there were so many assumptions about what the DA wanted and what the community groups wanted. And really it was the elder recycler who made these decisions. And that's what we always want to do, is center and support victims and survivors of crime, and all the ways that we can try to do that.
And Cynthia, do you want to also talk about the case that we worked on over the last few years with the family?
Yeah, this one is a hard one, and this is regarding Mrs. Huang, who was a victim of a heinous crime, and actually passed away a year after enduring this as a result of those injuries. And so this is an active case, and it's a difficult one because it's a series of other high-profile cases affecting Chinese elderly. And I think the work that we're trying to do here is, again, support the family who wants to pursue justice and is trying to also heal the community. And we're very fortunate to be working with the family members who see the need to, of course, address this issue and the ongoing safety issues, but also to really call out that we need to really support victims and survivors, and also address these long-term issues. And that's an active case again, and we continue to see these incidents. And so right now, what we're very much feeling is that the community is demanding justice in particular ways, because they haven't seen other models in place, and we haven't built that infrastructure. So while we talk about the ideals of restorative justice and what that will lend, we're at the beginnings of that and what that looks like, and how do we educate our community. They're big ideas and values, but we need to really help our communities understand what that means. It doesn't mean letting somebody go and not holding them accountable. It doesn't mean that we value the lives of Chinese people over other lives. So these are the things that I think we have to address that really speak to the frustration and anger that our community members feel. So I think it is really important that we look at systems, but how do we engage our community at the same time?
Thank you.
I have a question for Cynthia and Aarti. How can AABA members or members of the community who are concerned support the great work that ALC and CAA are doing?
Aarti, you want to go first?
Sure. I think, you know, in addition to the API hate work, we're doing a lot of rapid response work. And so we have many clinics that we're doing for low-wage workers who are trying to access benefits, and we're trying to help them navigate these complex systems. And so we could definitely use volunteers if you're an employment lawyer, or if you have language ability. You know, on our website, you can even just go to asianlawcaucus.org and it'll take you to our website. There is a volunteer form, and you can, you know, fill it out and let us know if you're available. So that would be one concrete thing that we're going to be continue to need support on, I think, throughout the year. The other piece of work that we're anticipating will really ramp up is the work for tenants. Right now, there's some protections in place, so some landlords are trying to get, you know, around those. But we, when the courts are back in session and evictions are, you know, moving forward, we are really concerned that low-income APIs, particularly seniors, are going to be facing eviction cases. So we're looking for, you know, obviously volunteers who would want to help in those areas. On the API hate piece, I think there are some campaigns that are policy related. If people want to get involved in, you could go to valueourfamilies.org. It's a campaign on family immigration, which I don't know if folks, you know, this immigration ban really impacts family immigration, and Asian Americans are going to be, as I mentioned before, significantly impacted by it. And we have to, as part of the narrative, I think our proactive narrative is step up and you know, defend and protect systems that have been, you know, systems that our communities rely on for bringing our families back together. So you could go to valueourfamilies.org and participate. The hashtag is #FamilyIsHome in that campaign. And then obviously the Muslim ban and any other immigration bans, the current ones or future ones, are things that I think folks could get engaged with on a policy level.
Well, we're not a legal advocacy organization, but we have work on a range of issues, from immigrant rights to worker justice, and of course, advancing racial justice and educational equity issues. So we're always looking for volunteers, board members. I mean, very simply, I think promoting this issue, talking about it with your family and friends and colleagues, I think will be really important. And to get involved wherever you feel like is meaningful on these critical fights. I agree with Aarti that there are so many issues that are impacting our community as essential workers, as undocumented community members, especially those that don't have access to federal economic relief programs. There's ways that you can donate to those efforts. Those of our communities that were suffering before the pandemic are really, really in bad shape. And so getting involved wherever you can and wherever is meaningful would be great.
I know we went over time a little bit, so thank you again so much to our speakers, Cynthia, Chesa, Aarti, and John, on speaking of this very important issue. I wanted to give you folks, last words we wrap this up.
Well, I'll just reiterate my thanks to all of you for making tonight possible and for the incredible work you do in the community. And also just say once again, we have a really tremendously large task and responsibility ahead of us. We have to undo decades and centuries worth of xenophobia and hatred that are deeply rooted in this country and being encouraged at high levels right now. And we have to do it using tools that are often blunt and imprecise and inadequate. In the district attorney's office, we are committed to public safety and to accountability, to providing meaningful support to crime victims, and to helping invest in strategies that prevent crime from being committed in the future. It's more complicated than just putting people in jail or convicting them of a crime. Sometimes that's a necessary part of the process. But in the long run, we look forward to building a San Francisco where we don't have hate crimes and we don't need to use those tools because we have strong, connected, mutually respectful communities. Thank you so much.
Cynthia or Aarti?
Well, I'll just echo thanks again for this opportunity. This is an important moment for our community to come together and to really look at what's really at play here in terms of the narrative, how it's manifesting, and sort of this long history of interpersonal to policies that are disproportionately affecting our communities. And so, again, thank you for this opportunity and real honor to be with these fellow panelists who are leading in very important ways.
I'll just add that I agree, this is an important moment. I think for Asian American communities, we are growing and it is imperative that we continue to build power, because without that, we're not going to change and as Chesa was saying, the systemic racism and violence that formed this country. And so if we want to be part of the solution, we absolutely have to come together and build power. And I will just say, as a Pan-Asian organization, as a South Asian, it's, sometimes people say, I'm this, like the region that people are from, or I'm the country that people are from. But part of the whole idea of having an Asian identity is about political power. And so we need to come together ourselves and then with other communities of color and communities fighting poverty in order to, make the changes that we want to see. So thank you for being a part of that. Really appreciate being here with all of you.
And I'll close out by reiterating what I've said and other panelists have said before. The key to this for those of us as Asian Americans, we really have to get involved. We have to support the organizations like ALC and CAA. We have to meet and get to know our district attorney, our local law enforcement for when we need them. But, just running to people when there's a problem, you don't have the relationship there. So this is a good time to start to build those relationships for all of us. I shoot out emails to random people that are doing good work all the time and say, hey, how can I help? Is there anything AABA can do? Is there anything I can do as an individual? Because I understand and I know from growing up without that support, and the way I grew up, the value of it. And something I love within AABA is that there's a lot of us on the board that kind of came from similar backgrounds, and learning from that kind of bias and discrimination growing up, we learned that, there needs to be a strong community working together to find solutions. And now more than ever, that's true. So thank you to everybody. that's watching. We really appreciate you taking the time to spend with us tonight. If you're not an AABA member, please join. You know, we have a lot of great committees and Civil Rights Committee, which put this on, that does the ground level work along with our friends and allies in the community. So I'm very proud of this organization. It was founded out on the roots of civil rights at a time when Asian Americans, you know, it was a very different world. And I'm grateful for everything that we've come together as a community and developed, but we have a lot more work to do. And as Aarti really said, it's about, you know, we hear the word power and we think of, you know, like some sort of, that's the threshold we need to sometimes to get into the door. Okay, if we want a state official to listen to us about a policy that's going to be enacted, a law that's going to be enacted, you know, me knocking on their door is great, but me, Aarti, and Cynthia, Chesa, and all of our friends and allies at the door, they're opening the door and they're listening. So, you know, I'm going to wrap up and just say, work together with all the communities like everybody has said tonight. Get involved, and thank you. Thank you, everybody. And, you know, knowing that people are engaged and interested in this, I think gives us all strength to keep doing the work that we're doing.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.